Hi everyone, my name is Gregory Conley. I am the president of the American Vaping Association, and I do have slides. While they get pulled up, the AVA, yes, is a nonprofit in the United States that advocates for fair and sensible policy for vapor products and electronic cigarettes with the aim of maximizing the number of smokers that voluntarily pick up these products and use them to quit smoking. Title of the presentation, Vapers, the Vaping Industry and Taxes, or as you'll see, the alternative title could be How Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, screwed up everything and why you should never visit it. So to start off, to give you the perspective as to how these taxes affect consumers and affect industry, the U.S. vaping market here in 2018. Bonnie Herzog of Wells Fargo estimates that the 2018 market, you have $5.5 billion in sales. And contrary to the news articles that they show photos of closed system products, the traditional cig-alikes, and try to act like that's the industry, for about 4 years, the open vapor products, e-liquid, tank systems, they've been the dominant market. And so even with the big growth of Juul, which now has 60%, not 60% overall market share, but 60% of the C-store, grocery store, et cetera, you still have the open vapor products with $3.5 billion leading the way. And in this market, the closed system space, it's where this industry started. And as the innovation came with open vapor products, you saw the tobacco industry begin to get involved. And naturally, they got involved with the closed systems. In 2012, Blue was acquired by Lorillard. And then 2013, 2014, which is when many of the events I'll be talking about took place, you had Mark 10 and Views being released by Altria and R.J. Reynolds. And what is the big difference between the two types of products? Volume. E-liquids are sold in the EU, 20 milliliters, but in the US, 10. In the US, 30, 60, 120 milliliters or more, so very large bottles. Meanwhile, closed system cartridges generally contain 1 to 2 milliliters of e-liquid. The first US vapor tax in 2010, at the time when there really were no active e-cigarette advocacy groups, there were no lobbyists on this topic, Minnesota introduced a bill that they claimed was to ban sales of vapor products to minors. They wanted to modernize their definition of another tobacco product. But as we discovered, in adding that definition, they took the FDA's definition of what a tobacco product is, any product containing, made, or derived from tobacco. And in doing so, they applied us in the taxation category. So that meant a 70% wholesale tax, the same tax that was applied to smokeless little cigars, et cetera, was applied to us. Then in 2013, the fine people of Minnesota decided that they wanted to build a new stadium for the Minnesota Vikings. So they raised the cigarette tax, $1.60 per pack, and raised that OTP tax, including any product containing, made, or derived from tobacco, to 95% of wholesale, nearly doubling the cost for a retailer to acquire the product. But it's not that simple. The effect in Minnesota. Up at the top, you have a bottle of e-liquid, a company in Minnesota that produces e-liquid for the market. The 95% wholesale tax is applied in Minnesota when nicotine first enters the market. So if you are a Minnesota manufacturer, from the time that tax went into effect, you are paying 95% wholesale on the nicotine that you imported into the state. Nicotine, you buy it in a big jug, a big bottle, and that, depending on the size, depending on the strength, that big bottle can end up being the nicotine used in hundreds of individual bottles of e-liquid. So you're talking about pennies on the dollar. So for the Minnesota manufacturers, you would think 95% tax. That must instantly mean that any vape shop that was open closed and there would be no new ones. No, all the shops in Minnesota largely just started carrying Minnesota-made brands because it would not add great costs. Who got utterly screwed in the deal? The large tobacco companies entering the space. They weren't going to set up Minnesota manufacturing facilities just to fill some tanks. So as you see in that blurry photo that I took, one single views ended up, if you are in a state like mine, probably $8 or $9. Minnesota, $13.50 ends up being the cost. So there is no way when they, even though it's a small volume of nicotine in that vial, in that cartridge, the tax gets applied to anything in that package, including the battery. So the closed system companies got very, very negatively impacted by this, and it has very much slowed down growth in those states versus the states that don't have these sort of taxes. So we had a solution, or at least there was a solution pitched. R.J. Reynolds came up with an idea in America. What's the fairest way, in their mind, to tax e-liquid? It's probably not to tax a product containing a battery, it's to tax on volume. So they came up with the idea in Oklahoma and South Carolina, two of the most conservative anti-tax states in the nation. They wanted to pass an example. So they went to Oklahoma and South Carolina and pitched to legislators on 5 cents per milliliter. And Vapers reacted very negatively. In Oklahoma, there was about 250, 300 Vapers and vape store owners that showed up to oppose that. And yet the Daily Caller put out an article that I may have contributed to that said Big Tobacco stubs out e-cigarette competitors. There were letters to the editors written lambasting the author of that bill, who was actually a proponent of tobacco harm reduction. But any tax, we felt, was unjustified, and especially, as you'll see, when they did get it passed. They went to their home state of North Carolina, understandably, and put it in a bill that was revenue neutral, so they couldn't say, oh, it's a tax hike. Here's the problem, though. That 5 cent per milliliter on a closed system product, nothing big. 1 or 2 milliliters, 5, 10 cents. But North Carolina, you can pick up a pack of cigarettes, and you're paying a 45-cent tax. Meanwhile, that 30 milliliter bottle in North Carolina, you're now paying a $1.50 tax, so 3 times the tax, more than 3 times the tax on cigarettes. Onward, you had Louisiana and Delaware pass 5 cents per milliliter, West Virginia 7.5 cents. Kansas had initially passed 20 cents per milliliter. So you're talking about $6 on a 30 milliliter bottle. They saw the effect of that in the opening months when that tax went into effect. Stores started to close. Much of Kansas is on the border of other states. You had vape shops from Oklahoma coming into Kansas and putting flyers on cars at Kansas vape shops saying, come over the border to Oklahoma, you don't have to pay any taxes. So they changed that to 5 cents per milliliter, thankfully. So we still had the big problem of Minnesota. How do you replace a 95% wholesale tax? As of now, the answer is you don't. Because the only way you can replace a tax is to try to say, our alternative will provide you the same amount of revenue. And when they crunched the numbers, they determined that they would need 30 cents per milliliter to match that 95% tax revenue. So again, you have a small cartridge, 2 milliliters, 60 cents, compared to 95%, that's small. But 30 milliliter bottle sold at a vape shop, $9 wholesale tax. 120 milliliters, $36. So this was pitched by a Republican legislator about 2-3 years in a row, and the industry and engaged consumers went to the Minnesota Capitol, contacted their legislators and said, this tax is bad, it needs to be reformed, but this is not the solution. And the sponsor eventually gave up. And so in the end, what approach is best for public health? We know from studies repeatedly that daily users of open systems, of the e-liquid, of the tank systems, are more likely to be smoke-free. But we also know that cigalikes and closed cartridge systems are very important for new vapors, for smokers who want to switch. So we don't want to disincentivize people from taking the first step towards becoming vapors. And we will see in the coming years, Juul and nicotine salt products may be revolutionizing the market to the point where market share of closed systems may outpace the market for the open systems. And not to mention, FDA regulation may deter the continued existence of these products. And so, of course, no tax is best policy, but what tax we'll end up with where we have to take one, we don't know. And in the end, you may end up in a case where it may be best to have a different tax rate, one tax rate for open versus one tax rate for closed. But the AVA, CASA here, and many others in this room will continue fighting for no extra tax on these products as a way of incentivizing smokers to switch. Thank you.